I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Hey, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like Live. Again, I'm Jared Ball, your host, and of course, happy to be here. Please, again, go to imixwhatilike.org and make sure you're subscribed and signed up there so you don't miss any of the variety of things I and my colleagues are involved in and producing across multimedia. You don't want to miss any of that. And of course, at I Mix What I Like for all of your social media as well. I know we have a big show, a lot of excitement around, of course, our guests coming up and well-deserved. But before we do get there, please just let me remind you, of course, to consider not only liking, sharing, and subscribing here, but becoming also a member as we look to build something I'll be hopefully announcing very soon, and or at least showing some sort of support for political prisoners and those working on their behalf. So either way, you're not contributing anything to any, me as an individual, anything like that. I don't want to be confused with a lot of what else happens on these platforms, but we're trying to build something that would require some support. And if you can, please consider doing that. And know that it's going to something, for a greater collective beyond this. Similarly, speaking of collectives, I was asked about this not long ago, and we happily announce that the Blacklash, the Africana Collective, is coming back in full effect. And in fact, as you see here, and is announced and can be found at imixwhatilike.org as well, we're going to be having a post-election purple haze democracy and its discontents conversation on the 20th of this month. Again, the link and all of that can be found at imixwhatilike.org, and you can join some of the Blacklash Collective, many of whom you've seen here on this platform individually over the last couple of weeks. All right, so let's get to our obviously to our guest, who many of you already know and would have read at least some of his many works. And that, of course, is Dr. Gerald Horne, who holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. His research has addressed issues of racism in a variety of relations involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, and war. He has also written extensively about the film industry, which I've found personally very interesting and exciting as well for my own professional work. And his latest of more than 30 books is The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. So without further ado, Dr. Gerald Horne, thanks again for joining me and us, and good morning to you.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me.
So as we talked just briefly off the air, there's a lot of topics that I want to raise sort of broadly with you to indirectly bring a discussion and focus of all your work, which has been remarkable in its amount, production, and quality. But as we agreed, and as you said, you insisted, you wanted us to start with what went down last week on January 6th, described even in some mainstream presses as terrorism and insurgency. How have you been interpreting, or how would you like for us to consider interpreting what happened the other day or last week?
Well, I think it was very serious. I'm afraid to say some of our friends on the left have, coincidentally or not, I think downplayed the significance, speaking of it as a, quote, riot, unquote. That is to say, if college students in Fort Lauderdale throw a garbage can through the window of Starbucks, that's a riot. If Euro-American men, often armed with plastic handcuffs, after having built a noose on the Capitol grounds, invade the sanctum of the Capitol, after some have broadcast that they would like to put a bullet through the noggin of Nancy Pelosi and are hunting for congresspersons, James Clyburn, the senior Black member of the Democratic caucus, suggests that there might have been complicity by the Capitol Police because he has a hideaway in that building that somehow they found, even though the office that he has with his name on the door, they did not molest at all. Now, somehow that's a riot too. I think as a person whose name I do not respect once suggested, this is defining deviancy down, so to speak. It's really sort of letting these insurrectionists and terrorists and seditionists off the hook. And I think it also ignores the details. That's the thing about these people in the United States. I mean, they have access to the internet and all sorts of sources. They don't seem to read that much. I mean, the Business Insider, which is a German publication, had an article just a few days ago based upon interviews with the peers of their security counterparts in the United States, suggesting that what took place on January 6th was not a security failure, but a failure of an attempt to prevent the transfer of power from Trump to Biden. I mean, obviously that's what it was. I mean, why else would people come out on January 6th? Why else would they be chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," for example? And it's very disturbing. It's almost as if some of our friends on the left, they just can't believe what they're seeing. They have a theory of the case. The theory of the case is that many of these folks that you saw invade the Capitol, they're actually social democrats in disguise. But somehow the Democratic Party does not do well by them, which may be true, but it denies these seditionists and invaders of agency. It's almost as if they don't know where they're going, and then they don't know history. I mean, the fact that the term settler colonialism is not the everyday vocabulary of people on the left, what does that mean? I mean, how do you think people like me and you got into North America? I mean, do we swim over? Were we voluntary migrants? I mean, this is lunacy. How was the land taken from the Native Americans? It was basically class collaboration between and amongst poorer and richer Europeans for their mutual benefit. And you just saw an expression of that at January 6th, but people can't digest that apparently. They can't comprehend it apparently. And so therefore they define it downward. It was a riot. And then try to critique those who say it was a failed insurrection or a failed coup d'etat. But we already know in the press reports just today that we're not out of the woods yet. That's one of the reasons why I want to talk about this immediately. January 17th, January 20th, January 17th, January 20th, there are going to be manifestations in 50 different capitals. There will probably be a return to Washington, D.C. Most of these folks who are basically letting the seditionists off the hook, they don't talk about what happened in Lansing, Michigan a few weeks ago when these militiamen were arrested after their plan was exposed, supposedly to invade the state capitol, blow it up in a made-for-TV extravaganza, and then as a sideline, kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, who had been in conflict with Agent Orange, Mr. 45, and execute her too. I guess that all of this is just too awesome. It's just too overwhelming. And so therefore, people who oftentimes pride themselves on their realism have, I'm afraid to say, retreated into a kind of panty-waisted idealism.
Could first of all, it was hard, even in watching some of the video, it would be hard to say, I hope we didn't lose Professor Horne. Did you freeze there? Uh-oh. He ended so heavily that he froze himself. He was hitting so hard that he froze himself. Hopefully Professor Horne can get back on here. I'm not sure. Am I frozen? Are folks seeing me? Uh-oh. All right. Oh, okay. Okay. He's reconnecting. Okay. Very good. Very good. Professor Horne.
Oh, okay. I had to go to my phone.
Yeah. Okay. I was saying you were going so hard, you broke the stream. So I'm glad we didn't lose you entirely, and that there was some form of backup that we could get you connected on. All I was attempting to say was that it was hard to watch video of the events at the Capitol the other day, and seeing even the moments where the crowd organized itself into the heave ho chant as they were pushing against the police barricaded doorway. It's hard to watch that and not suggest that there was some, I don't know, some sort of level of. Uh-oh. Are you hearing me right now? Professor Horne, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I see you, but I don't hear. You don't hear me? Uh-oh. And now he's frozen again. Yikes. Oh man. Anyway, I know he is endeavoring to get this worked out. So
Hey, I hear you now, Jared.
okay, you do hear me. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I still think you're lagging a little bit, but if we can as long as we can hear you, I think we can at least make do for now.
Sure.
And hopefully we can get it. But essentially all I was saying was I recognized that there was some sort of coordination, and that there was that at a level beyond just what might have been considered just normal disorganized anger in the street. And then I was hoping to get you to elaborate and as a segue to even talk a little bit about your new book before we go back to some of these broader topics, to elaborate on what you mean about the importance of recognizing this as originating with settler colonialism, and the absence of that analysis is such a problem.
Well, it reminds me when I was in graduate school. You might have had this experience too. These mainstream bourgeois professors, they'd always compare the United States to England. And so therefore, England had a monarchy, United States didn't. 1 point for the United States. And so they would go down this list. But what they should have been doing is comparing the United States to other settler colonial regimes. For example, Canada, which did not have a so-called revolution, but has the gold standard that the left tells us about in terms of healthcare, in terms of single payer. Or they should compare it to South Africa or Southern Africa, Rhodesia and South Africa in terms of settler colonial regimes. Or they should compare it to Australia, which by
Oh, the internets are conspiring today. This is terrible. This is by far the worst we've had it since we've been doing these streams. So this is unfortunate to have this happen with Professor Horne. Because I first of all agree that an analysis of settler colonialism is essential. Yeah, the internets, that they are stopping that hot fire. I'm with you on that, Ryan. That's messed up. Right.
Hey, are you there?
We are. We're trying to make light of these connection issues because everybody's very excited to get into this with you and to hear from you. So,
okay. So what I was saying is that I think the United States should be compared to other settler colonial regimes, which seems to me elementary. And when it's compared to even other settler colonial regimes, it comes up short. So, but that hasn't really dawned. Hopefully, the events of January 6th will cause an upset and a kind of agonizing reappraisal of this country. But the fact that it hasn't happened in 250 years is not reassuring.
Yeah. I mean, similar to what I think you were describing about the bourgeois professors, is that sometimes we might even hear them reference, you might even hear some reference to the United States as an empire, but then the logic from that doesn't seem to follow. Well, what do empires create? They don't create freedom and democracies. They create colonies and settlers regimes and all of that. So why wouldn't we continue to follow that logic in terms of outcomes? But one person who I might simplify as saying was evolving towards that kind of analysis is often commemorated in this country for a version of himself that was not performing that analysis. And I'm speaking of someone I wanted to ask you about, who's going to be commemorated here for his birthday in a couple of days, of course, Dr. King. And there is a version of him and his work that is promoted, and there is, of course, a more complicated and I think fascinating and radical history of real history. But when you deal with these commemorations and reflect on Dr. King, I did want to ask you how you see him fitting into your broader tapestry, the broader tapestry of your work, which is often focused on Black radicalism, internationalism, colonialism, anti-imperial politics and struggles. Where does King fit in, or should we see him fitting in? Oh man, my Darth Vader voice. No. Yeah, absolutely. I remember the first time I read that, I was in grad school and was blown away and shocked at the version of King that I was reading there.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry.
No problem. I was just
I got the question. I mean, I would say the King fits into this body of work. Not coincidentally, in my book on India, he appears on the cover because, of course, he had a certain kind of internationalism himself. Indeed, I once wrote an essay about what I call the, quote, Moscow Negroes, Tokyo Negroes, and New Delhi Negroes, with Moscow, Robeson et al. Tokyo, as I pointed out in my book on Japan, and it's oftentimes forgotten, a lot of the pre-1945 Black nationalists were pro-Tokyo. Because Tokyo presented itself as the champion of the colored races. That's where the whole concept of the Asiatic Black man comes from. I mean, people who invoke that concept, I'm not even sure if they know where it comes from. And then, of course, what happens is that the United States drops the atomic weapon on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan, perhaps understandably, is converted into a U.S. ally. But sadly, that whole history of alliance with Black America is wiped out. Was wiped away from the board. And then we all know what happened to Robeson and company. They were marginalized, persecuted, isolated, passports taken, driven into exile, oftentimes driven into suicide. And then that leaves the New Delhi option. Now, what's interesting is that even with regard to King, as is well known, the NAACP, which is still the largest and oldest organization, not only excoriated Robeson to its utter I think that was ridiculous and absurd. But of course, as you know, many of the leaders criticized King too, particularly after he came out against the war in Vietnam as part of his internationalism. So I think that King deserves the accolades that he has received. Certainly, he doesn't deserve what has been called the Santa Clausification that has been bestowed upon him. And I would also say that I respect the fact that King tried to maintain relations with the late Jack O'Dell, who, as you know, comes out of the left, was once one of King's top advisors, formerly a chairman of the board of Pacifica Radio, as you know, before dying in self-imposed exile in Vancouver, British Columbia. And it was Kennedy, President Kennedy himself, who took King into the Rose Garden of the White House to escape the bugs that he thought J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI might have implanted inside, and told King to distance himself from Jack. When King says he would do so, but then apparently does not, then leads to J. Edgar Hoover calling King a notorious liar, etc. So I think that given the correlation of forces in the United States of America, where you have this stunning class collaboration between and amongst Europeans, poorer and richer descent. And this created a formidable obstacle for Black people seeking freedom. It did not necessarily admit to too many alternatives. And I think even given the positive international situation that helped to put wind in King's sails, the fact that Africa was surging to independence in the 1950s, along with the Caribbean. The United States wanted to compete for hearts and minds with the then socialist camp. So it is under pressure to ease restrictions and the egregious racism that's inflicted on Black Americans. So with positive conditions, but still it required expert navigation. And I think that's what King helped to provide.
Yeah, just had a quick question here, just to clarify, and if I'm reading this correctly, and understanding correctly, what Professor Horne, and he can clarify himself, was saying was that prior to the Second World War and the bombing of Okinawa and Hiroshima, the rise of Japan was seen by Black people in this country and others around the world as a sort of a world majority, positive response or antithesis to European imperialism. Correct? Did I?
Well, not only that, but
yeah.
I see these questions. Look at my book; it's all there. I mean, people were placed on trial. I mean, as of November '42, in East St. Louis, Illinois, right across the Mississippi River from my hometown, St. Louis, Missouri, you had Black people in military uniform engaging in military drills, anticipating a Japanese invasion of the United States that they planned to join. Now, of course, they got rolled up. They got arrested, indicted, convicted, imprisoned. And of course, that was a landmark on the road to the United States triumphing in World War II, before Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
So sort of, the often promoted as the sort of antithesis to Dr. King was Malcolm X, famously of the Ballot or Bullet speech, and we're often this sort of running ongoing discussion and debate that comes up all the time. I thought I would just throw the broad question to you. When you look at this broad history, this internationalist struggle of colonized people against the colonial, powers, where are you in the ballot versus bullet debate in terms of advancing struggle? What is the relationship between the two in terms of advancing or having positive impact on the world?
Well, I mean, I think it depends upon the objective conditions under which you are toiling. I mean, for example, in Southern Africa, our brothers and sisters, they leaned towards, quote, the bullet, unquote, and they were armed by the former Soviet Union, assisted by Cuban troops in the decisive battles of the 1980s. You had similar trends in the United States. Just in the paper this morning, there's a story about how Michael Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, is seeking to put Cuba on the terrorist list. And one of the reasons is the presence in Cuba of Assata Shakur, who, as you know, was affiliated with forces in the United States some years ago that felt that armed struggle should be the preferred option. So I don't think that we should necessarily juxtapose these forces against each other. I referred to Dr. King's internationalism. Obviously, Malcolm X had a component of internationalism in his portfolio as well, with regard to traveling in Ghana, which I talk about in my Shirley Graham Du Bois book, or going to the newly formed Organization of African Unity, as it was then called, in East Africa, for example. So, we started off by talking about how people on the left don't necessarily agree with regard to characterizing the tumultuous events of January 6th. So just because people may have similar ultimate goals in mind, such as people on the left, such as King and Malcolm, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll agree upon necessarily every tactic. But I don't think we should use that to denigrate, at least with regard to King and Malcolm, one or the other.
Right. So we're already at 30 minutes, and I feel like we haven't even gotten started yet. So I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit to some if I can, some of your work or some of the discussion around your work with the 1619 project, or I should say some of the discussion around the 1619 project to which you contributed. I guess I should put it that way. And and the other day I watched. I know I'm late on it. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna mute you because I think the typing is coming through. But while I read this, I just want to I happened to watch the debate. Not a debate. I'm sorry, it wasn't a debate. The panel you were on with some of your colleagues who contributed to that project. I think it was in New York, or before the pandemic, a year or two ago. But I happened to be watching it on the 1st of January, the new year. And as I was watching it, it did occur to me that this was also the anniversary of the killing of Oscar Grant. And I was thinking at one point in the exchange, I was thinking, well, Oscar Grant, this is the anniversary of Oscar Grant's killing, where he has to be humanized to white audiences in order for there to be some sort of understanding about what he, why he was killed and what he represents in terms of the broader history of those kinds of killings. But at one point in the conversation, particularly as it turned to the so-called founding fathers of this country, it seemed interesting that some on your panel struggled with what you took for granted. That is, that the founders did not see African people as human, but it is that is the founders' inhumanity that is both the cause of so much of the world's problems and yet seems invisible still to so many, even these prominent scholars with whom you were paneling. So anyway, it seemed that someone on the panel had to work somehow to see the inhumanity of Europeans or whites and founders, or the founders so-called. Okay, I got you. Okay, there we go. I see you switching. We appreciate that. All right. Anyway, so it seemed that some of the panel had to work to see the inhumanity of the white founding fathers, even at this point in time, as you were just trying to raise their inhumanity in trying to set some context for what was happening in the project, the 1619 project itself. So I'm just wondering if what, if any, response you might have to that, this issue of the inhumanity of founding fathers and white still invisible, and the Black humanity, or the humanity of Black people, also remaining seemingly invisible. And I don't know if you got any of that.
Yeah, well, the 1619 project, as you know, it was produced by the New York Times, Nicole Hannah-Jones, August 2019. And what's interesting is that, of course, when she and her colleagues had to produce that project, and most of the New York Times Magazine special issue dealt with contemporary manifestations of slavery. And I think that's one of the problems, because U.S. historians, bless their little hearts, they have this tendency of throwing up a great wall between the past and the present. And many U.S. historians, they are proud of the fact that they are blissfully ignorant of what's going on in the world today. I mean, as I said, if they were physicians, you, as a patient, would go to visit them, and they would take your medical history, as physicians tend to do. And then you say, okay, doc, you got my medical history. You asked me about my grandmother, my grandfather, great-grandmother, grandfather. So what's the diagnosis? And they said, oh, I don't know. I was just taking that down for intellectual purposes, not because I have some sort of diagnosis of your malady. And so historians like myself, and to a degree, these New York Times journalists, they're trying to figure out, why are we in such a pickle in this country that, at least until January 6th, was lauded as this great democracy? And so inevitably they go back to slavery. in order to try to understand that phenomenon. Now, of course, I didn't necessarily agree with every jot and tittle of the 1619 Project. I noticed, by the way, that in her essay on this past Sunday in the New York Times, Charlene Hunter Galt, the former New York Times journalist and writer for the New Yorker who desegregated the University of Georgia, 1961, she marked the arrival of Africans in what is now the United States in the 1520s, which of course is more accurate. And that dovetails with my book that you so kindly mentioned at the top of the show on the 16th century. But even these historians, if you look at the textbooks of these historians, they don't talk about the 1520s. I mean, it's malpractice. So one of the points I was trying to make in that forum that you saw earlier this year is that part of the problem is with these historians. I think that they've done a disservice to history. They've certainly done a disservice to the people of the United States. And they tend to always try to let the United States off the hook. I mean, for example, I just made a few moments ago a reference to how the socialist camp created conditions for not only the erosion of colonialism, but the erosion of Jim Crow. Now, with regard to analyzing the socialist camp, many of these historians say it was all screwed up, terrible, awful. With regard to the United States, which came into the world stage dripping from the blood of enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples, they don't say that. They say, well, there was a Bill of Rights, even though the Bill of Rights did not apply to us. There was an apartheid Bill of Rights. It was an apartheid constitution, as people are dimly beginning to recognize today. So I'm just asking some of these historians to adopt that old principle. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Don't come to me with this propaganda about the United States in a one-sided fashion and then try to defame, libel, and slander those of us who helped to rescue us from the claws and the clutches of U.S. imperialism.
There was a moment in that exchange in that panel where
are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. You're not hearing me? We're having a rough time today. Is this you're not hearing me? Oh Lord. Wow. Is nobody hearing me?
Oh God.
Oh man. Yeah, we're having a tough time today. Nobody's hearing me. You don't hear me? Can anybody hear me?
Oh, really?
Hello? Uh-oh. Can anybody hear me? Okay, the audience is hearing me. Let's
Okay,
do you hear me there? Okay. Do you hear me now? Can you hear me, Dr. Horne?
Now the sound is off.
Oh my goodness.
Let me forward this link to you, see what you can do with it.
No. Oh Lord.
Maybe you can get it on your phone.
Yeah, no, we all hear, everybody hears. Is this any better, Dr. Horne? Can you hear me? We all hear you, and everybody hears me. We're both being heard loud and clear in the Netherlands. Shout out to the Netherlands. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Just make sure there's no feedback going.
Hello?
Okay, wait. Add this one to the stream. Are you? Is that one working?
No, this one seems.
Wait.
And this one?
Yeah. Mic is working.
Do you hear?
No, just go leave the screen. That's all.
Okay. Do you hear?
Are you there?
Yep, we're here. Do you hear us? Do you hear me?
Let's check your camera and mic.
Wow. He's not hearing me either. Oh, shout out to Cote d'Ivoire. Thank you for checking us out. West Africa's in the building. That's what's up. Appreciate you. I wish this was going better for all of us. But I'm not sure. I don't think I've ever seen this before, honestly, where we can hear him, you all can hear me, but he can't hear me. We'll try over here.
You want to try it on my laptop?
No.
Hello.
Okay, I'm here.
Okay, which one is that working on? Is that you there?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Let's try the.
Let's try this.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me on this one? Oh man, just let him go. Now we can't just let him go. We can't just let him go. Are you with us now? Does that work?
So. Yep.
Okay. All right. So anyway, I appreciate you struggling to get with us a little bit. What I was going to ask was, there was a part in the exchange on that panel where so I wrote down here, when whites of that time, that is I'm assuming the 18th and 17th centuries, but or even the 19th century, when whites at that time called out the hypocrisy of slave. Oh no, this would have been just before the American Revolution. When whites of that time called out the hypocrisy of slave owners calling for liberty. When whites of that time called out the hypocrisy of slave owners calling for liberty, how much of that do you think is the equivalent of or similar to the post-election, the past election, when Trump was saying that Biden had 47 years in politics to do whatever he had claimed he was going to do now?
Oh, I see. You mean a plague on both their houses?
Well, in other words, I mean, it seems it seems. It does. I'm not that I'm at all a Trump supporter, but it did seem a funny a bit of contradiction and hypocrisy when, as you all were talking about, there were whites of that time who were trying to point out that slave owners were calling for liberty from the British. Because at one point of the panel, there was a discussion about to what extent were white people during that time actually against slavery? To what extent was there a true white, I think, abolitionist movement or something to that extent? Or to what extent did white society support abolition? And you mentioned that there were those who were saying that there was a hypocrisy, of slave owners calling for liberty from England. And then I was thinking of just the election that had just occurred, where I did think it was kind of interesting and a strong point that he was making when Trump would say to Biden, everything you're now saying you're going to do for everybody, you never did in the 47 years while you were in office. So it's just something I wrote down. I don't know that there's a legit question or comment that I'm inviting from you, but I did, I did write it down as I was watching the panel and thought I'd ask.
Well, with regard to Trump, it's hard for me to give him any credit for anything. I think that we should already begin measuring him for an orange jumpsuit. We should already begin criminal charges to be leveled against him in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, and particularly in New York City and New York State, where a pardon of himself only exempts him from federal charges. In any case, I think to keep the spotlight on the hypocrisy of those who founded this country, who, as you suggest, at once were clamoring for alleged liberty. Some might say the liberty to more forcefully enslave Africans, because as I said in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, in June 1772 in London, you had Somerset's case, which illegalized slavery in England. There was a fear that that decision would leapfrog the Atlantic, apply to the colonies, just like laws in the United States oftentimes apply to the colony that is Puerto Rico, thereby jeopardizing the fortunes of a murderous row of slave owners, including founding fathers Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, lawyer for founding fathers, lawyer for slave owners like John Adams. And rather than accede to that, they kicked out London. And of course, London also, with the Royal Proclamation of 1762, 1763, was expressing displeasure at continuing moving west, seizing the land of the Native Americans and turning it over to real estate speculators like George Washington. So that's the accurate story of how this US empire was initially created. But instead, we get this blather and propaganda that I would hope exploded into smithereens on January 6th about this so-called cradle of liberty, shining city on the hill. At the same time, Africans are being snatched from the shores of the continent and dragged across the Atlantic. At the same time, as I pointed out in my book on Brazil, one of the reasons why you have such a large Black population in Brazil is because of the manic energy of US slave owners in the 1830s and 1840s, when Brazil's Black population increased exponentially. The same holds true for the Black population of Cuba. And so basically, you have these historians as propagandists, as Du Bois once said in his book, Black Reconstruction, who have been throwing dust in the eyes of the population, basically deceiving the broad masses of the country. And then when the 1619 Project comes along with these journalists from the New York Times who are not historians, but they're trying to figure out what's going on. And then these historians, like a pack of jackals that they are, leap upon them with bloodthirsty savagery and try to discredit them. So once again, hopefully in this post-January 6th world, we'll be able to assess these questions much more honestly and directly.
Have you, forgive me if I missed it, but have you actually sat down to address directly any particular critiques of criticisms of the 1619 Project? Have any, even been from your perspective worthy of a response? Because there's been a lot, and from across the political spectrum as well. I remember I read in one that, I think the World Socialist Web critique said something to the extent that there was, one of the criticisms was about the labor movement was ignored and the intervening years, something to like the labor movement was ignored, the class struggle was suppressed for some sort of palliative race narrative, something to that. But are there any that you've seen that were worthy of response that you sought to address specifically?
Certainly not from the World Socialist Web, which singled me out for particular criticism, believe it or not, which is not surprising. Mm-hmm. There's this quote socialist unquote by the name of Leo Panitch, who just passed away. Mm-hmm. I was on a forum with him right before he passed away, and I was excoriating white supremacy, and then he interjected that was divisive, and then he began to try to instruct me about how the communists in the 1930s were campaigning on interracial unity. Now, he didn't even realize that I've probably written more on that subject than anybody on planet Earth. I mean, that shows you when I want to talk about people don't read, I mean, he's telling me about something I've written about 5 books about, for example. And that's the kind of ignorance that you have on the US left, which I'm afraid to say was also exemplified in those sectarian, one-sided critiques on the worldwide socialist web, which of course took to task particularly the Black historian, myself, who has written most consistently from the left, for whatever reason.
Yeah, anyway, I thought, I don't follow them that closely, but I found when I was trying to look up responses to the project about a year or so ago, theirs was being prominently passed around, and I guess I'm not surprised why, but I was just curious if you had seen any from any circles worthy of I don't know. Anyway, so
well, if you do a search, you'll see that from August 2019 till about I don't know, maybe the mid 2020, I was commenting all the time on the 1619 Project. But my position was that the critiques of them were so one-sided, so racist, so dripping with white supremacy, that it made it difficult for me to point out what I just pointed out to you and your audience, which is that 1619 is sort of a faux date. I mean, actually, as I point out in my book in the 16th century, from their perch in Santo Domingo, the Spanish bring Africans to what is now South Carolina in the 1520s, but they rebel, defect to the Native American side, chase the Spanish back to Santo Domingo, back to the Caribbean. And then, of course, the Spanish come into St. Augustine, Florida in 1565 with enslaved Africans in tow. So where we fixated on this 1619 project in Virginia, it's a kind of Anglocentrism. It doesn't matter until the English speakers do it. It's almost portraying this as sort of pre-US history where you take United States for granted. So I said that all over the place. But once again, if your battery's going down, if there are those under attack who are trying to say something progressive, I'm not going to be siding with the ultra leftists and the white supremacists who call themselves leftists.
So, because I know we're getting a little bit close to this hour, I want to see if I can get some of these comments and questions in from our audience, and hopefully we haven't lost you again. But I thought this one was of particular interest and actually reminds me of what I was looking at even before we went live. Something you wrote at the end of your the Counter-Revolution of 1776 book. So the question here, in the age of rule of law and legislation, shouldn't the left more often refer to Articles 25 and 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to defend, argue for, and promote socialism? And maybe if you can get to it, maybe put in some context of Black appeals, Black struggles and appeals to the UN or to this particular doctrine.
Well, look, I mean, I used to be a lawyer. I was the head of the National Conference of Black Lawyers. During my tenure with NCBL, we repeatedly raised up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We even tried to walk in the footsteps of Robeson and take the United Nations to the United States to the United States and put the United States on the dock, with the best case scenario being sanctions against the United States for the deprivation of human rights of Black people. However, I would like to remind the commenter that the correlation of forces in the United States is not very positive right now for progressive forces, as the not only January 6th suggests, but also the election that you made reference to, a choice between neoliberalism and fascism. And that's just a product of, it's a direct product of settler colonialism. It's a direct product of class collaboration, particularly between and amongst poorer and richer Europeans, which mumbling word to say about. So, yes, let's read the Declaration of Human Rights about where.
I'm not. Did you freeze? Were you able to finish? We broke up there towards the end. I think. Did we? Okay.
I'm back.
Okay. I think we're having a tough time today. You know, it did occur to me. A lot of people are making jokes and references to big tech hating on our conversation, and I did think to ask you about the I guess relative controversy around Twitter deplatforming Donald Trump, and the I don't know, somewhat debate about censorship, with even Angela Merkel chiming in recently. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know a lot of people on the left actually support the deplatforming. I happen to think it is quote unquote that slippery slope, and I don't prefer that CEOs of big tech corporations be able to decide in secrecy who gets to use the more prominent communicative platforms or networks. But do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, sure. I mean, I think what it argues for is treating particularly Facebook like what it is, a public utility. That is to say that there should be aggressive support from the left, not only for this anti-Trump action that's being brought by the United States government, but for an actual eventual takeover of Facebook, having it administered democratically. Now, in regard to the deplatforming of Trump under these current political conditions, I don't buy the argument that that serves as a precedent for deplatforming me, for example. Because as you know, I mean, I heard Louis Farrakhan speaking just the other day. He was talking about how he got ousted from one of these platforms. And apparently that was not seen as having any sort of presidential value, didn't necessarily create any outrage. And so at this particularly fraught moment, when, as noted, on January 17th and January 20th, you might have a simultaneous armed uprising in the United States of America, I have no particular problem at this particular moment with the deplatforming of Donald J. Trump. I don't necessarily see it as a precedent for myself, because we know that in the United States, there's a long history of having one set of rules for these people, another set of rules for these people. I mean, for example, the Second Amendment, which is supposedly holy writ in the United States of America, it didn't apply to the Native Americans. Matter of fact, the strategic objective of the settlers was to keep arms out of the hands of Americans. Certainly didn't apply to the Africans. If it had, I assure you that slavery would have ended well before 1865. So I think we have to be careful with these kinds of mechanistic, legalistic arguments, straight from the playbook of the ACLU. And I understand why lawyers make those arguments. I used to be a lawyer myself. If I was still a lawyer, I might make the argument too. But they're not necessarily politically sound, and they're not necessarily historically sound.
Well, Professor Horne, unfortunately, you know, we're up against the hour already, and I know because of the struggles with the network, it's already being suggested, and I happily will get on this immediately, that we seek to reschedule and do this again. But if we could, just before you leave, you know, if there's anything you would want to tell us about your new book. I would certainly like a chance to get it and read it and have you back to talk about it. And maybe in the context of that, maybe again, so I think I hear you sort of ringing an alarm of sorts about a potential coming of violence from these Proud Boy types. And I've seen a number of people online and even message me privately suggesting that they're hearing warnings and that Black and brown folks go grocery shopping and then stay home these next few days. Is that where you are in all of this? And then any last words that you might have for us?
Well, if without putting you on the spot, if this line is secure, I can go beyond the hour. But if you have to go, that's fine. That's fine.
No, I don't have to go. I'm not going to be the one to shut it down.
The next week or so.
No, it's just a concern over the connection. That's all. That's all. Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
With regard to the events of the next week or so, see, this is the problem. You know, some of our friends on the quote friends unquote of the left, I raised the question of severe and stiff prosecution of these miscreants who invaded the Capitol. Some people on the left criticize me. But my position is that it'll make the streets safer for people like me and my brothers and sisters and cousins if people like those invaders are kept off the streets. I mean, that's the bitter reality. Secondly, I think it would act as a deterrence to those who would like to act similarly of which there are thousands, if not more. And then third, I think it'll introduce strains in the Republican Party coalition, which hopefully could lead to a split in the Republican Party coalition, which would be a step forward for progressive politics. I've also been instructed that it would be that any sort of crackdown on these miscreants bode well for me. Well, look, things don't bode well for me in any case. So I'm not sure what the crackdown on criminals have to do with me. And in any case, with regard to laws, there's a say, well, there's going to be these laws passed. Well, it depends on what the law is. If you pass a law that says it's illegal to enter the Capitol with handcuffs after constructing a gallows on the grounds of the Capitol with the aim of dragging certain congressmen out of their offices to lynch them, well, yeah, I think that should be illegal. I mean, and if you look at the press, part of what we're being told now is that this so-called rioters, as they've been euphemistically termed, that they have the idea still that they're going to liquidate all of the opposition politically to Donald J. Trump to remain in office. Now, of course, some people say, oh, we shouldn't take that seriously. But obviously, as I said, they're not keeping up with the news. I guess they're not keeping up with Ammon Bundy out in Idaho and in Eastern Oregon. They're not keeping up with the events in Lansing I described. They're not keeping up with the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the 3%ers, their transatlantic ties. I mean, I think what happens is that people fixate on a theory of the case, which is that, oh, the Democrats are just raising the specter in order to weaken the Republican opposition, not apparently cognizant or aware of the fact that the Republicans have not suffered in the polls from their base as a result of January 6th, and that the Republicans have an advantage in the United States since they routinely win a majority of the voters of European descent, which give automatic leverage and balance. So we should not be shedding any tears for the Republican Party or those who are acting in their name. Second point, the book, Bittersweet Science, Racism, Racquetball, Economy of Boxing. It's a follow-on to my book on jazz. It's a follow-on to my book on film. With thread, the role of organized crime. Organized crime, particularly Italian American and Jewish American organized crime, have a particular bane for the existence of Black Americans, only in those two fields, music and sports, boxing, but in general. This book tells a story also about how and why Black Americans have been successful in the ring. Part of it starts in Africa, coincidentally enough, when the enslavers begin to arrive hundreds of years ago. Coincidentally enough, various kinds of martial arts begin to develop in Africa that reaches a kind of efflorescence with capoeira, of course, in Brazil. And then in the United States of America, you have a situation of the battle royale. Bo Jack, who was a Black lightweight champion, Madison Square Garden star of the 1940s, he got his start in Augusta, GA, in the battle royal. That's when, for their entertainment back in the day, in slavery and post-slavery, the racists would put 7, 8, 9 Black and blindfold them, and whoever emerges triumphant gets a prize. So that helps to explain why so many of us with our fists.
So Ralph Ellison just wasn't pure fiction at the time, right?
As a concept, although it's long since book. Masculinity.
Oh man, Dr. Horne, I'm sorry, man. I think
rampant that Black.
Dr. Horne, I think we gotta I think we're going to have to. I hate to say it, man. I think we have to reconvene another time. We're having a really tough time with the connection here. I hate it. I hate it. I don't want to be the one, but all I'm going to say is well, first I want to say thank you, and then secondly, I want to say I'm going to immediately, as soon as we hang up, email you about rescheduling as soon as we can. I don't know if we can. I don't know to what extent that would help, or what's exactly going on, but I really, at the same time, want to be respectful of your time and our audience, but also the ability to have the conversation I know that we need to have. So let me just end here by saying thank you, and I'm going to endeavor immediately, like I said, immediately as soon as we hang up, I'm going to email you about trying to get on your schedule for another session. Let's see what's happening. So listen, everybody, let me did you hear any of that, Professor Horne?
Yeah, I heard that we're about to close.
Yeah, although
I've just gotten, see what happens is that actually this is a political economy point. One of the things I've noticed, how sometimes with your Apple iPhone, it'll begin to have problems. And I think it's directed from central headquarters so that you'll be encouraged to go buy another one.
Yep.
With regard to my internet, sometimes they begin in the morning, as they know I'm about to get to work, they begin to give me problems, hoping that I'll call and maybe upgrade or whatever. And then it disappears for the rest of the day. And so now I'm back. This is a regular. So if we do reschedule, it probably should be in the afternoon.
Well, we'll definitely do that, but to the extent that it's working now, I would like for you to if you can, return to the point that I heard you making, but I don't think was coming through clearly enough about the battle royale, and where some of us were noting that Ralph Ellison wasn't necessarily picking from pure fantasy as he wrote his work. Then. In other words, is what you're telling us.
Yeah, this is real. BoJack, I mean, actually, I start the book by talking about BoJack in the Battle Royale. Mm-hmm. And then to skip ahead, I was about to tackle the question of masculinity, because there was this idea that black men were not real men, whatever that means. And because real men, quote unquote, don't allow themselves to be enslaved or pushed around under Jim Crow. And so what that does, it seems to me, is imbue in many black men this desire to overturn this stereotype, this defamation, if you like. In other words, we're responsible for our own plight. And they could do this in the boxing ring, where they could earn good money for beating white men into submission, and you could get arrested for even thinking about it once you left the ring. So this helps to create the career in the first instance of Jack Johnson, for example, Galveston, Texas, born 1878, heavyweight champion by 1910. His rising creates the need in some quarters for a so-called Great White Hope, who would restore what was thought to be the normalcy of masculinity. And he, of course, has criminal charges hung around his neck, not least because of his dating proclivities, and dating Euro-American women, or even marrying them for that matter. So he flees the country. In my book, Black and Brown, I talk about how he allies with the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. Then he travels overseas. He says Barcelona, his favorite town. Eventually, he has to face the music and is jailed in the United States, but he goes on and, in fact, returns to Barcelona in the 1930s, where he establishes a socialist newspaper, and then, of course, dies tragically in an accident in the 1940s. Now, of course, we all know about Joe Louis, the Brown bomber, who was also part of progressive forces that's oftentimes forgotten. I think because of his conflict with Joe Louis, because his conflict with Jack Johnson, because he and Jack Johnson had real conflicts. But Joe Louis, of course, was a fan of Paul Robeson. You may be familiar with the Paul Robeson song. You can find it on the internet, King Joe, with Count Basie Parker, for example. And Joe Louis supported the third-party campaign of Henry A. Wallace in 1948, the last gasp, in a sense, of the left, seriously challenging for power. Of course, Henry Wallace was backed by Robeson, Shirley Graham Du Bois et al. However, because of his ties to the left, Lewis also runs into stormy problems. That is to say, tax problems in the first place. And then he's perceived as veering out of his lane when, as he's retiring from boxing, he tries to, in a sense, take over the whole sport. The problem there is organized crime. And I think one of the lessons, and as a man who's written about business, I'm sure this would resonate with you. One of the lessons there is that if you think you can construct a business without having juice with the prosecutors and the district attorneys, you're basically in a fool's errand. Because if your peers and competitors have juice with the prosecutors and district attorney, that means that those legal barracudas are coming after you, which is what happened with Joe Louis, for example. So I also, of course, talk about the man once known as Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, how in some ways the Nation of Islam and the Fruit of Islam act as a kind of backup to protect him from the dire fate of boxers who did not have backup and then fell victim to organized crime, for example. So that's the story. I could go into the innards, since you're a scholar as well. A lot of the records of the New York State Athletic Commission in Albany, oral histories at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, the State Athletic Commission of California, organized crime investigations in New Jersey, many memoirs, biographies, etc. And of course, these tremendous boxing archives, which are located at the University of Notre Dame, located at Brooklyn College in New York City, etc.
So I'm sure, oh man, there's so much. Let me just mute that for a second, mute you for a quick second so the echo doesn't come through. Maybe I'll come back to that, but since I'm a little off my clock and I'm not sure how we're going to go, let me get to a couple other things real quick. I did want you to talk about your book on jazz and justice, because if for no other reason, having been a programmer at the mighty WPFW in Washington, D.C., a Pacifica affiliate, and having hosted one of the forums or variations of the block known as Jazz and Justice, being my dear brother Kaba, currently hosting the African Deep Thought edition of Jazz and Justice, and being part of what was affectionately known as Jazz and Justice Radio. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that book and that relationship between jazz and justice.
Well, this is a book that, in terms of periodization, does not divert from the story that this music we call jazz, which presupposes expert mastery of various instruments like piano, percussion, horns, strings, etc., has a birthplace in New Orleans. Now, I think one of the reasons why we say this, beyond what might be obvious, is that the scholars at Tulane University in New Orleans began to take oral histories of New Orleans musicians in the 1950s, some of whom were born in the 1860s. And so therefore, if you're trying to trace the history of this music in the post-Civil War era, the main sources are in New Orleans. Now, if scholars at Memphis State University or University of Memphis had done the same thing, perhaps we'd be talking about a different story. Perhaps if scholars up the Mississippi River at Washington University in St. Louis had been as industrious as the oral historians at Tulane, we'd be talking about St. Louis as the birthplace. But anyway, New Orleans is the birthplace. But one of the issues that I deal with, once again, is organized crime. And one of the, I think, pivotal vignettes in this book talks about the 1920s, when in St. Louis, you have organized crime factions who control the clubs, and of course, to a certain extent, still do, to the extent that they're open during the pandemic, were in a battle with Ku Klux Klan forces in St. Louis who did not want Black musicians employed at all. And so there was a showdown, a literal showdown between them. Organized crime, not surprisingly, emerges triumphant, and Black musicians win the poisoned award of being able to be exploited by organized crime as opposed to being excluded by the Klan. And of course, I tell the story about all the musicians who have been cheated. And of course, I tell the same story in boxing, by the way. You have leading musicians, even Duke Ellington of your Washington, D.C. Some of his early compositions, his name is not on the composition. Irving Mills' his name is on the composition, which means that the estate and the descendants of Duke Ellington for some of these tunes are not reaping the benefits, but the descendants of Irving Mills, they are reaping the benefits of what Duke Ellington created. Of course, I talk about how material conditions are shaping the music. I mean, for example, for the longest time, as you probably know, there was an element of dance, heterosexual dancing with regard to this music. But when clubs during World War II began to allow this, there was a revulsion in certain circles, not least because it was interracial heterosexual dancing. And that was broken up. And then you had sort of a natural evolution to a listening music. So people didn't, Black men didn't have to touch these white women with their precious souls. I also talk about the attempt by folks like Max Roach, the drummer. And by the way, whenever I have a microphone before me, I mention that his papers are at the Library of Congress. Amiri Baraka, the late Amiri Baraka, has started a kind of, as told to memoir, as told to autobiography. The notes are all there. Somebody needs to finish that project. In any case, in the 1950s...
I'm about to cut this out of the replay, Doc. But it's funny you said that, because I have a note to ask you that exact question. I mean, I'm serious, but I'm joking. But because we can come back to it. But specifically the question, you know, because I've seen you in a number of other interviews make some kind of, you drop a gem just like that. And I was going to ask if you have any gems in particular to drop, or trails for young Black scholars in particular to pick up on as they're either starting or you know, earlier on in their careers, or maybe now that you dropped that one for some of us and maybe in the middle of ours, I might have to. That's a nice one right there. But anyway,
forget it's that. Almost finished. I mean, Baraka did all the work. All you have to do is assemble it and put your name on the cover. That's all you have. And well, that's an exaggeration, actually, but
I know, but wow. But just to see that's fascinating. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So in the 1950s, Max and Mingus, they start debut records. Once again, they're trying to take control of the music, but it's hard because you have these organized crime barracudas. Many of these musicians practice 16 hours a day. So how are you going to practice 16 hours a day and then run a record company on the side? And so debut records goes belly up. And so I should also say, Errol Garner, the pianist, he has a tremendous archive at the University of Pittsburgh. I don't think there have been any biographies of Errol Garner as I recall. And then, of course, he was involved in a very pivotal case in the 1950s that established musicians' rights, for example. When I was reading the other day about the lawsuit between Nicki Minaj and Tracy Chapman, it reminded me of the Earl Garner case. And I also deal with unions because.
By the way, oh man, when you were looking at that case, I meant to do this myself. Did one thing that I wanted to look for is beyond the headline, which I have not gotten to, is I'm assuming that Tracy Chapman she holds her own copyright. But I was wondering, does Nicki Minaj actually even own the copyrights to the music that she's nominally attached to?
Oh, I see.
Because the work that I have done, it's been some years now, but when I have done my own work on the music industry, and so your point about the organized crime is, it's amazing. It's everywhere. But there's also this issue of most of the people that we end up seeing famously on TV or on radio or elsewhere don't necessarily own their own music, and that creates a whole other, sometimes violent, side industry or combative arena. So I was just actually wondering if you happen to know any of the details beyond or what would happen with that case, because I thought it was interesting. Anyway.
Well, no, I don't. I only read about an article in the New York Times that was maybe about 150 words. That's all I know about that case. I should also mention, since you raised this point, I just reviewed this book on what's called Gangster Rap in Los Angeles. And one of the things that struck me was that most of the material was based upon newspaper articles, even though the author was trying to tell a story about how social conditions created this music, and not even adverting to the point that in Los Angeles is a citadel of organized crime. Particularly in Hollywood. And so it would seem to me inevitable, if you know Los Angeles, that people in South Los Angeles would look across the city at what's going on in Culver City and what's going on with the studios and saying that they're basically organized crime infested. It might come up with the idea that they need to emulate that. But in any case, I also deal with the unions. And it's very controversial because these unions, they're not necessarily, I'm a union person. I used to be an officer in a union. My father was a Teamster. I'm pro-union all the way. But we have to face it, that in the United States, sometimes, as I said in my book on the National Maritime Union, sometimes these unions, the headquarters would be a union headquarters during the day and a Klan headquarters at night. And so with regard to musicians unions, they fit that latter model. And so you had these so-called segregated unions, the colored locals, as they were called. But as a result, and this fits in, I know a lot of our younger friends, they like to cite this point. So here's some grist for their mill. That is to say that with the era of desegregation, what happens is that the colored locals are liquidated. Oftentimes their records are tossed in the garbage. Their treasuries are turned over basically to these Klan-dominated unions in the interest of integration, by the way. And it was not necessarily a step forward for these Black musicians when that whole process unfolded in the 1950s and 1960s.
Does the book, do you look at any of the one of the things that when I briefly was looking at some of these histories was the ways in which artists, whether it was in hip hop when I was looking at it, but also I noticed it in trying to draw some comparisons to jazz, the way in which the both organized crime apparatus, but also the corporate industry apparatus, including particularly the takeover particularly with hip hop, the influence of copyright, which has changed the landscape in terms of beat production and ownership and relative wealth creation. But also what I'm asking about here is the specific impact on behavior and performance. So I remember, for instance, when Miles Davis talked about playing downtown for white folks and then going uptown to hear the real jazz he would play later for Black communities and things of that nature. Is there, I I don't know. I'm interested in what you may have focused on or looked at or how many or how often or how prevalent that kind of impact was. That is the impact of the industry in shaping the way Black artists would perform their art for commercial success or acceptance, etc.
Well, one example that I would cite is from the 1930s in Chicago, where most of the clubs, and by the way, a lot of the performances take place at clubs that are controlled by organized crime sharks, and that oftentimes there'd be in the middle of a performance the tap, tap, tap of gunshots. And then you would see musicians sort of emulate that sound with regard to the bass of the piano or even the drum, for that matter. In other words, they were emulating gunshots. And I think, with all due respect to the field of jazz studies, and I was just a fellow traveler, I'm not a permanent citizen of that state. But with all due respect, I mean, I think that one of the reasons I wrote this book, because I felt that there was a need for it. And I think that oftentimes in dealing with the arts, that writers and analysts and scholars, they become very ethereal. I mean, they kind of lose track of material conditions, which is, I think, unfortunate when you to lose track of material conditions, particularly when you're talking about Black artists. It seems to me is a flagrant omission.
Absolutely. The last question I have to ask you about is that you have historically written for Freedom Waves magazine, and my colleague Dr. Todd Stephen Burrows has done a lot of work on this, and it has been a focus in his work. The history of that magazine is of particular personal importance to me in terms of people who have written for it and what it had represented historically. Could you just talk a little bit about that publication and what it, I don't know, means contextually? I don't know, just something about that publication.
So yeah, as you correctly say, I used to write for Freedom Waves magazine, was based in New York, 80 East 11th Street, which is the equivalent of 799 Broadway. I still remember that. I used to go to the office all the time. And it was started in the early 1960s. One of the original founders, Esther Cooper Jackson, is still in the land of the living. She's about 103 years old, living in the U.S. Northeast. And you'll see her quoted in many dissertations and master's theses. And I just recommended to somebody the other day that they interview her because, she has a very good recollection. Shirley Graham Du Bois, for example. Jack Odell was a founder who I made reference to a moment ago. It was a quarterly review of the freedom movement, I think it was called. It had a fair amount of influence. John Henry Clark, you might recall.
That's right.
Was one of the
and that was one of my initial connections in terms of my own research, and Dr. Burrows actually did and at imixwhatilike.org, for those who are interested, a really classic interview with Dr. Clark about his time at Freedom Waves. It was very interesting. Anyway, yeah.
And so it did. The issues are still worth reading. You can still find them at libraries. I'm sure they have a full run at the Schomburg, for example. But I remember vividly that it ran aground, like so many, I'm afraid to say, after it began to focus on Palestinian rights. This caused quite an outcry. And it's very unfortunate. And by the way, just as a footnote, with 2 points. One, I think my book on the 16th century provides a suitable context for understanding the complicated, complex relations between Black Americans and Jewish Americans. And I recommend that to anyone who is interested in pursuing that. Secondly, is that I hope that when you edit this interview, you have enough good material for it to be worthy of your audience's time.
So I don't think we have to worry about that.
Hmm.
I don't think we have to worry about that. It's definitely been worth it. And as I said, even though we've gone a little longer, I am going to be in touch very soon about trying to get back on your calendar for another one, because not only to make up for some of the technical difficulties, but also because there's an endless amount of issues to get to. And I still have more of your work to read between now and then. So, I mean, like I said, I will be in touch soon anyway, regardless of yeah, right. And as your colleague and co-author Dr. Sharice Burden-Stelly is reminding us, we're live, so there's not going to be a whole lot of editing or whatever. Although I am going to do some and make some segments out of this one for sure. And in fact, have the two of you ever been interviewed together about your work on Du Bois?
Well, yeah, at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, when we had a book signing, and it's probably online somewhere.
Well, no, well, I'm going to see if we can recreate that here. Selfishly, to since anyway, Dr. Horne, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I definitely appreciate your work. And for those of us who can't write 30 plus books, we can certainly endeavor to interview 30 people about the 30 books that they've written in the 60. Anyway, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again. Take good care, Professor Horne.
Thank you for inviting me. Good luck.
Anytime. Thank you. And thanks everybody for sticking around with us and struggling through the technical difficulties. I am going to, with this one, cut this into some segments later on and maybe clean up where I can some parts, and because I think it's that important, and we will certainly look to get him back. Please come back to imixwhatilike.org and this channel. We have a lot of stuff coming up all week, all next week, a lot of great people. And exciting interviews and discussions, and some announcements still being built, so please stick around for that. Also, like, subscribe, share, consider becoming a member, and help us continue to build. And with that, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. Again, I greatly appreciate everybody. Appreciate it. Oh, wait a minute. I said I didn't do this the last time, and if bear with me if you all can stick around. I want to make sure that I publicly thank some folks, because I appreciate that we've gotten some members, and I understand why you're doing it. So I want to definitely thank Dr. Sharice Burden-Stelly just signed up. Nia, Derek, Willie, Michael, Jesse, Joseph, Gary, the one who goes by my favorite, George Jackson. Thank you, Kevin, Easy D, Vivek, John, Ross, Culture 88, Renegade Pharaoh. Definitely thank you very much. Marvin, Black Neto, Leah, Sister Leah, thank you very much. Awa, Baba Sundiata, thank you. Craig, Rudy, Brother Tafari, Jadarian, Miss J Free, thank you all very much. And we invite many more of you to join up and help us. As Dev, thank you for signing up just now. Again, more or less, relatively speaking, I'm gainfully employed, so this is not for my own personal pockets. Even better yet, my wife is even betterly, is that even a word? She's even better gainfully employed. So this is not personal. This is we're trying to build some collective media projects and do some more work for political prisoners. So that's what all this would be for. So thank you. Dev, DPR, thank you. I appreciate all of you for joining from wherever you are around the world. Dr. Horne is certainly a great draw. We appreciate that. And of course, others not as famous as him that we have interviewed and will continue to interview are equally valuable. So please consider supporting them for all. And certainly we rock with this, free them all. So anyway, it's been fun. It's always a lot of good times here. I enjoy doing this a lot. It's good to be able to do it and to have you all join us. And we certainly appreciate it. James Pope, Dr. Pope, good looking out. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate that as well. And as soon as I can get this announcement off, we're going to do it. So anyway, I'm just waiting on waiting on the comrades to get everything. Anyway, thank you very much. Like Fred Hampton used to say, to you we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody, and we'll catch you next time right here at I Mix What I Like Live.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.